Welcome, dreamer. You found your way once again to Whispers of the Night, a quiet corner where stories breathe softly and the world slows just enough for you to rest. Tonight, I invite you to settle in. Let the lights around you dim. Let the air grow still. Allow the day to fall behind you like the tide. The sea is calm outside the window. A candle flickers on the table. And somewhere beyond the walls of this little cottage, the hour 3:03 a.m. waits, patient, timeless, almost alive. You are safe here. There's nowhere to go, nothing to prove, only quiet and the promise of a story that drifts between dreaming and waking. Breathe slowly in through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your thoughts loosen like threads caught in the wind. Before we begin, take a moment to join our small circle of wanderers by subscribing to Whispers of the Night. Each story here is a lantern lit in the dark, a space made for peace, stillness, and imagination. Now close your eyes. Let's step together toward the sound of the waves and open the door that only waits at 3:03 a.m. The night deepens. The sound of waves moves closer, slow and steady, like breathing. Silara sits beside her window, the candlelight trembling gently in the quiet air. The scent of lavender drifts around her, light as memory. She writes slowly in her journal, her words falling into the page like drops into still water. Outside, the world has grown soft. Even the stars seem to whisper. The sea breathes against the cliffs, the same rhythm that moves within her chest. You can feel that rhythm too, that gentle, endless tide within you. Each inhale, each exhale, a wave. Each thought, a shell carried out to sea. Let your shoulders release. Let your hands rest lightly at your sides. You are safe. You are still. The cottage hums faintly with old life, wood creaking softly, the clock's steady hush. In this moment, nothing demands your attention. The world beyond these walls can wait. All that exists now is breath, warmth, and the quiet pulse of time passing kindly. Silara sets down her pen, her eyes close for a moment, not in weariness, but in peace. The candlelight flickers, the kind of light that listens. Outside, the tide turns slowly, folding itself into silence. Let yourself drift with her. Let your thoughts soften like mist over the sea. You are standing at the edge of dreams now, where time slows, and even the smallest sound feels infinite. Stay here in this calm. The story is waiting. The hour is near, and soon we'll open the door that only appears when the world finally sleeps. The door that opens at 3:03 a.m. A door that opens only at 3:03 a.m. The house that listens. The cottage had been empty for years before Silara found it. It sat at the edge of the coast, its wooden bones weathered by salt and silence, as though the sea itself had been trying to remember the sound of people living there. From her first step inside, she could feel that the house breathed differently from the rest of the world. The air was thick with memory, the scent of damp wood and old pages, a faint trace of lavender hidden somewhere between the floorboards. It didn't feel haunted exactly, but it didn't feel empty either. Silara had come looking for quiet. For months, she'd been drifting between borrowed rooms, carrying the kind of tiredness that sleep couldn't touch. She had lost too much too soon, a relationship that had slipped through her fingers like fog, a job that had demanded all her hours but given her nothing back, a version of herself that once laughed easily. The sea, she thought, might help her learn to breathe again. It had a rhythm she trusted. It left and returned faithfully. Like forgiveness. During the day, the cottage looked almost harmless. Sunlight spilled through salt-streaked windows, tracing pale lines across the worn floor. The wallpaper peeled like skin after a sunburn, but the imperfections made it gentler, somehow more human. Every time Silara opened a window, the breeze brought the distant cry of gulls and the metallic scent of tidewater. She would sit by the sill with a cup of tea, letting the sound of the waves fold over her until it felt like they were breathing together. It was at night that the house changed. The first evening, Silara unpacked slowly, her few clothes, her notebooks, a framed photograph she wasn't ready to look at yet. She placed a small clock on the bedside table, a gift from her grandmother. It was a delicate brass thing with thin black hands and a soft ticking sound that made her feel less alone. Outside, the sea murmured against the rocks, its voice deep and endless. When she finally turned off the lamp, the darkness felt almost kind. She dreamed of waves rising higher and higher, but instead of crashing, they folded over each other like blankets. In the dream, she heard a sound, a low creak, faint but rhythmic, like a door swinging open and shut in the wind. When she woke, the sound was still there. She lay still, her eyes adjusting to the faint silver light slipping through the curtains. The clock glowed softly. 3:03 a.m. The sound came again, a single, deliberate creak, as if the house had shifted to listen to her. Silara sat up, her heart beat quiet but quick. The cottage was too old for panic. Old houses moved, breathed. That was what people said, wasn't it? Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this sound wasn't the same as wood expanding or the wind pressing against the roof. It was too precise, too alive. She got out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cold wood of the floor. The air felt heavier than before, the kind that hums faintly against your skin. She walked through the small hallway, her fingers trailing along the wall as though the texture might tell her something. The kitchen was still, the front door closed. She stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing, only the hush of waves outside and the soft thrum of her own breath. After a few minutes, she went back to bed, convincing herself that she must have imagined it. But when she tried to sleep, she noticed the clock again. Its second hand had stopped moving. She tapped the glass gently, expecting it to start again, but it didn't. The time stayed frozen at 3:03. The next morning, the sea looked unusually bright. The sky was pale blue, washed clean by a night of quiet mist. Silara made coffee and walked down to the water. The sand was cool under her feet, patterned with thin trails of seaweed and shells. A fisherman at the far end of the beach raised his hand in greeting. She nodded back, though she didn't know him. The tide came in softly, lapping against her ankles like a cat brushing past her legs. For a while, the world felt steady again. She told herself she had simply been tired. Moving to a new place always left her uneasy the first few nights. The sound must have been the old beams adjusting, or maybe a loose shutter catching in the breeze. Houses near the sea always made strange noises, didn't they? That afternoon, she read on the porch until the sun dipped low and the air smelled faintly of salt and rain. When she went to bed that night, she left a lamp on in the corner, just in case. The soft glow painted the room in honey light, turning shadows into sleepy shapes. She fell asleep, listening to the same rhythm of waves and wind. And again, at 3:03, the sound returned. This time, she was awake enough to be certain. The noise came not from outside, but from within the house. A single, deep creak, followed by the faintest sigh, as if the air on the other side of a door had changed places. She held her breath. No footsteps followed. No breeze moved her curtains. Only that one sound, patient and deliberate. She sat up, watching the hands of the clock remain still, locked at that impossible time. A thin chill spread through her, not of fear, but of recognition. It was the feeling of standing in a place that remembered something you didn't. The next morning, she went to town. The village was small, a cluster of houses with faded paint, a bakery that smelled of sugar and sea salt, and a small antiques shop tucked between a post office and a flower stall. The shopkeeper was an older woman, with hair the color of oyster shells and eyes that seemed to know everyone's stories before they were told. "You're the one renting the coastal cottage," the woman said before Silara even introduced herself. "That house hasn't had a tenant in years." Silara nodded. "It's peaceful," she said softly, though the word felt slightly untrue. The woman smiled without warmth. Peaceful can mean many things by the sea. Some nights, even the waves forget to sleep. When Silara mentioned the sound, just a passing curiosity, she claimed the woman's expression shifted slightly. "Ah," she murmured, turning a porcelain cup in her hands. "That would be the hour. The hour. Every house along that part of the coast keeps a different hour," the woman said. "But yours, the old cottage by the cliffs, 303, used to belong to a clockmaker long before my time. Built a door that never quite belonged to the house. They say it opened on its own, but only for a minute, once the world was still enough to listen." Silara felt a shiver trace her spine. What happened to him? The woman only shrugged. "Some say he left through it. Others say he's still waiting on the other side." She placed the cup down with care. "Best to keep your doors locked, dear. Not everything that knocks should be welcomed." Silara thanked her and left, but the woman's words followed her all the way back up the hill. When she reached the cottage, the tide was pulling away, leaving glistening lines of foam along the shore. The house stood quiet, indifferent to her thoughts. That evening, she explored the rooms more carefully. She tapped along the walls, checked the hinges of every door, pressed against the edges of the floorboards. Nothing unusual yet. Once, when her hand brushed the far end of the hallway, she thought she felt a faint vibration under the wallpaper, like a heartbeat muffled by wood. She withdrew her hand quickly, reminding herself how exhaustion could make ordinary things seem strange. By midnight, she was writing in her notebook, recording the sounds she'd heard and the legend the woman had told her. The act of writing calmed her. It gave shape to the uncertainty. She wrote, 303 again. The house listens. Maybe it's not trying to scare me. Maybe it just remembers. She closed the notebook and stared at the wall opposite her bed. The lamplight trembled slightly, as though touched by breath. She told herself she would stay awake and prove that nothing happened, that it was only her imagination looping through fatigue and loneliness. But the sea has its own ways of lulling people to sleep. She must have drifted off, because when she opened her eyes again, the room was steeped in silver. The lamp had gone out. The clock by her bed glowed faintly, frozen again at 3:03, and there it was, the creak, slow and sure, followed by silence so deep it seemed alive. She turned her head toward the hallway. The darkness there felt different now, denser, like fog pressing against glass. She whispered to herself that it was just the wind, that there was nothing there. But the truth was simpler and stranger. The house was listening again. This time, she decided to listen back. She stepped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The boards under her feet were cool, almost damp. She walked toward the sound's origin, every step softer than the last, until she stood at the end of the corridor where the shadows pooled thickest. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the windows were shut. For a moment she thought she saw a thin seam in the wall, a line so fine it could have been a trick of the light. She reached out to touch it, but before her fingers met the surface, the creak came again, quieter this time, like the sigh of someone almost asleep. And then, nothing. Her clock began ticking again, its second hand jumping forward with a quiet click. The air lightened. The silence dissolved into the gentle rhythm of waves. It was 3:04. Silara stood there for a long while, hand hovering near the wall, heart strangely calm. Whatever had happened, or almost happened, had already passed. When she finally went back to bed, she wrote one more line before sleep took her. The house doesn't want to frighten me. It only wants to be heard. Outside, the sea murmured against the shore, a low and endless heartbeat. Inside, the old cottage seemed to sigh, a sound halfway between relief and remembrance, as the minute hand of the clock slipped quietly toward morning. The Hour of the Sea. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the air around the cottage had grown thick with thought. Silara began to notice the way time seemed to soften whenever the tide came in. Even in daylight, the ocean moved with an unhurried grace. as though it too was remembering something it could not quite name. She started to keep a journal beside her bed, noting each time she woke to that still moment at 3:03. Every entry felt like a whisper between her and the house, two quiet souls trying to understand each other. Each night, the same pattern unfolded. The temperature dipped slightly, just enough for her breath to fog the window. The faint smell of lavender appeared again, mingling with salt and sea mist. Then her small brass clock, the one that had ticked faithfully for years, stopped. The second hand froze exactly on the number 3. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Maybe the batteries were fading, she thought, or the humidity was affecting the mechanism. But she replaced the batteries, cleaned the casing, even placed a second clock beside it for comparison. Every time, the same thing happened. Both clocks stopped together, always at 3:03, and resumed again 1 minute later, as though time itself was briefly taking a breath. It wasn't frightening, exactly. It felt more like being watched by something kind but unknowable. Like the moment before a wave breaks, that thin edge of silence before sound returns. During the days, she began to explore the village more deeply, hoping to untangle the threads of what she had heard in the shopkeeper's story. The town was small enough that everyone seemed to know her by sight now. When she walked past the bakery, the man behind the counter nodded. The children on the beach called her the lady in the listening house. Sometimes she would sit outside the cafe near the pier, sketching the horizon in her notebook. The sky there had a particular shade of blue, thin and endless, like the color between waking and sleep. The locals liked to talk to her, but when she mentioned her cottage, their eyes always softened in that quiet way people use when they don't want to share what they know. One afternoon, she returned to the same antique shop where she had spoken to the old woman before. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, though no one else was inside. The air smelled of old wood and dried flowers. The woman looked up from polishing a glass clock and smiled faintly. "Back again, dear." Silara nodded. "I wanted to ask you more about what you said the other day about the clockmaker." The woman set the clock down carefully. "Ah, yes. The man who built a door that didn't belong. You've heard the house, haven't you?" "I think so," Silara admitted. "It's always at 3:03. The air changes, and sometimes I smell lavender." The woman's expression grew distant, thoughtful. Lavender. His daughter used to wear it. The scent would follow her wherever she went, like she carried springtime in her pockets. Silara's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. His daughter. She was the one who found him, or so they say, the woman said softly. He'd been building clocks for years, fine ones, delicate as music boxes. But near the end of his life, he became obsessed with a different kind of time, not minutes or hours, but the spaces between them. He said he could hear the world breathing in those spaces. Silara listened, the words washing over her like tide water. "And the door? He built it in secret," the woman replied. "Said it would open only when time was perfectly still. The hour when the sea forgot to move, the air forgot to breathe. Some said he'd gone mad, but on the night it opened, he disappeared. They never found him. Only his clock remained, frozen forever at 3:03. The woman's eyes flickered toward the window, where gulls drifted low across the horizon. "You live in his house now, don't you?" Silara hesitated. "Yes." The woman nodded slowly, as though confirming something she already knew. "Then perhaps it chose you. The house does that sometimes. Finds the ones who listen too closely to silence." Silara felt a shiver move through her, not of fear, but of strange recognition. She thanked the woman and stepped back into the salt wind as she walked home along the cliffs. The sea glittered like liquid glass beneath the late afternoon sun. The waves seemed to move slower, each one folding upon itself like a sigh. The sky had that faint pink glow that comes before nightfall, when everything softens into memory. The cottage appeared at the end of the path, small and patient against the vastness of the ocean. Its windows caught the last light, reflecting it back in uneven shards. She paused for a moment, watching the sea breathe in and out, wondering if time could truly have places where it hesitated, if moments could stretch like the tide, pulling one life into another. That evening, she brewed tea and sat by the window, notebook open, listening to the slow rhythm of waves. She wrote down the fragments she could remember of the woman's story: the clockmaker, a door, lavender, lost time. The words looked strange and weightless on paper, like something borrowed from a dream. When the first hints of fog rolled in, she lit a small candle. The flame flickered gently, throwing warm light across the walls. The cottage looked softer now, less like a stranger's house and more like something alive. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what kind of man would build a door to another moment. Perhaps he wasn't trying to escape at all, she thought. Perhaps he was trying to return. The clock on her table ticked quietly beside her, its rhythm steady, hypnotic. She watched the second hand make its endless circles. 1 minute, 2, then 3. And right as it reached the 4th, the ticking stopped. Her breath caught. The air cooled instantly, brushing against her skin like mist. The scent of lavender bloomed faintly around her, delicate and sweet, carried by no wind. The candle's flame trembled once, as if bowing to something unseen. Silara leaned forward, eyes fixed on the clock. The hands were frozen again. 3:03. Outside, the sea had gone still. She could no longer hear the waves, only the faint hum of the world holding its breath. Even the air seemed suspended, every dust mote hanging mid-air, glowing softly in the candlelight. A deep quiet filled the house. Not emptiness, something fuller, denser, like the silence between the last note of a song and the echo that follows. And beneath that quiet, Silara heard something else, a faint rhythmic ticking, but not from the clock. It was coming from behind the wall. She stood, moving slowly, her bare feet silent on the wood. The ticking grew louder, yet it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded human, almost like the beating of a slow, deliberate heart. She whispered, her voice barely forming. The sound stopped. Then a single creak, the same door sound she had heard before, only deeper now, more weighted with presence. A thin line of cold air brushed against her ankle, as if something had shifted behind the wall. She took a step back, her eyes darting toward the candle. Its flame was stretching sideways, pulled gently toward the hallway. and then, as softly as it had begun, the air warmed again. The flame straightened, the lavender faded, the ticking resumed its ordinary rhythm. Silara looked down at the clock. 3:04. It was as if the world had released a breath it didn't know it was holding. She sank into the chair, her pulse steady but slow, almost entranced. There was no fear, only an ache of curiosity, a longing to understand what existed in that one quiet minute. Later that morning, she stood by the shore as dawn rose like a pale whisper. The waves had returned, restless again, churning softly against the sand. She felt their rhythm inside her chest, the same pull, the same retreat. It was strange how comfort and unease could live so close together. She wondered if the clockmaker had stood here once, watching this same horizon, feeling the same tug between wanting to stay and wanting to know. Maybe the door hadn't stolen him away at all. Maybe it had given him what he'd been searching for, a single moment where time finally listened back. Silara picked up a small shell from the shore, holding it against her ear. Inside, she could hear the faint echo of waves, distant and endless. But beneath that, for just a second, she could have sworn she heard the soft click of a turning gear, a clock somewhere beneath the sea, marking an hour that didn't belong to any world she knew. She walked back to the cottage, the shell still in her hand, the sound fading into silence. That night, as she prepared for sleep, she whispered into the darkness, as if speaking to an unseen friend. "If you're there," she said quietly, "I can hear you." And though the house made no reply, the walls seemed to hum faintly. Content. When the clock stopped again at 3:03, Silara was already awake, waiting, listening this time. The silence didn't scare her. It felt like being invited. The hidden frame. Days began to fold into one another like slow-moving tides, soft and seamless. Silara spent her mornings by the window, sketching the light that drifted across her cottage walls. It changed color throughout the day, blue-gray at dawn, honeyed gold at noon, then that muted rose tone that appeared just before dusk, as if the air itself remembered something tender. Yet beneath that calm rhythm, something had begun to stir quietly, a pulse she couldn't name. The cottage had started to hum in faint intervals, a sound too delicate to record, but to present, to ignore. It wasn't the sea, nor the wind, nor the usual small movements of an old wooden house. It felt alive, like breath, or thought, or the quiet heartbeat of time itself. One afternoon, while rearranging the narrow shelves near her writing desk, Silara brushed her hand against a patch of uneven wood. The shelf wobbled slightly, tilting just enough for her to notice a thin, irregular line etched into the plaster behind it. She leaned closer. It wasn't just a crack. It was a frame, a faint rectangle, no larger than a door, pressed beneath the surface of the wall. Its edges were sharp, deliberate, as though something had once been sealed there. The longer she looked at it, the more she felt a strange recognition stir. Not memory, exactly, but the quiet familiarity of something seen in a dream long ago. The air near that wall felt colder. The scent of lavender returned for a heartbeat, drifting past her cheek and fading before she could breathe it in fully. She moved the shelf aside, her fingers tracing the outline. There were tiny metal nails along the edge, nearly invisible beneath layers of paint. Someone had gone to great effort to hide it, yet not completely erase it. The outline wanted to be found. She stood there for a long while, the sound of the sea slipping faintly through the open window. Outside, the gulls called to one another, but their voices felt far away, as though she were already somewhere else, standing between 2 hours of the same day. That night, she dreamt of the shore again, but it wasn't the same beach she walked in waking life. This one was endless and white, lit by a pale, dreamlike light. The waves moved in reverse, folding themselves back into the horizon. And there, near the water's edge, stood a small girl with dark hair and bare feet. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. The girl was humming softly, her voice blending with the waves. In her hands, she held a music box, small, silver, gleaming faintly like moonlight, caught in metal. Silara wanted to speak, but when she opened her mouth, the air filled with salt. The girl looked up, and for a moment, Silara saw her own reflection in those eyes. Not recognition, exactly, but something deeper, like the echo of a shared heartbeat. The girl smiled faintly and turned the key of the music box. A melody floated out, fragile and haunting, notes that seemed half-remembered from somewhere in Silara's childhood. The sound lingered, impossibly clear. Long after she woke, the morning light spilled into her room in thin threads. For a moment, she thought she could still hear the melody, faint and far away, like something caught in the walls. She sat up slowly, her pulse steady but strange. When she turned toward the shelf, her breath caught. The crack had deepened overnight. The frame was clearer now, its outline no longer faint, but visible, even in the morning sun. As though it had grown, Silara pressed her fingers against it. The wall was cold, almost damp. A soft vibration trembled beneath her touch, not loud enough to hear, but enough to feel, like the subtle rhythm of a sleeping heart. She withdrew her hand and stared for a long time, all day. She tried to distract herself. She walked along the cliff path, bought bread from the bakery, watched children skipping stones at the shore. But the feeling followed her, that subtle tug, that invisible thread connecting her to the house. Each sound of creaking wood, each flutter of curtains felt alive, aware by evening. Clouds had begun to gather over the sea. The light grew dim and heavy, the kind that turns everything a deep, metallic blue. Silara lit a single candle, though the moment she did, the flame flickered toward the sealed wall. It was as if the air in the room shifted, listening. She sat near her desk, notebook open, trying to write down what she felt. But the words blurred, unsteady. Instead, she drew faint lines of the crack, the outline of a door, the little girl on the shore. Her hand moved faster than her thought. When she finished, she realized something chilling. The girl she'd drawn was holding the same shell Silara kept on her table, the one she'd picked up days ago. She glanced toward it. The shell lay quietly beside the clock, but in the candlelight it seemed to pulse faintly, as if remembering a distant rhythm. The next night, the dreams deepened. She found herself standing not on the shore this time, but inside her own cottage, yet different. Everything looked softer, translucent, as if made from mist. The shelves were there, but the wall behind them was open, the hidden frame no longer sealed. A pale door stood in its place, its surface smooth and glistening like pearl. From behind it came a low hum, the sound of waves beneath glass, deep and endless. Silara stepped closer. The scent of lavender thickened, mingling with the sound of a clock ticking somewhere far away. She reached for the door. Her fingers brushed the cool surface, and suddenly she saw flashes, moments from a life that felt both hers and not hers. A hand winding a clock, a small child laughing near the water, a man's voice calling from another room. Then a sudden silence when she woke. Her face was damp with tears. The clock read 3:04. She didn't remember when she had fallen asleep. The candle was still burning faintly beside her, though the wax had almost melted through. The air felt different, thinner, quieter. She could sense something waiting. Over the next few days, the dreams became more vivid. Each time she closed her eyes, the same music box played in the distance. The melody shifted slightly each night, as if guiding her somewhere, not frighteningly, but insistently, like a forgotten song wanting to be finished. Silara began leaving her notebook open on her desk before sleeping. Every morning, new faint smudges appeared across the paper, marks she didn't remember making, circles, lines, sometimes single words written in her own hand. Remember, shore, door. She stopped questioning when she had written them. Some part of her knew she had, though not in waking time. The cottage seemed to share her awareness now. When she moved through its rooms, the floorboards responded like soft sighs beneath her feet. The curtains shifted, even without wind. The scent of lavender lingered longer each night, and the frame, the hidden door, began to breathe. But she could sense a slow rhythm behind it, like something expanding and contracting in sync with her pulse. At 3:03, it grew strongest. One night, unable to resist, Silara sat facing the sealed wall, candlelight trembling across her face. She waited until the second hand of her clock reached the number 3. The instant it froze, everything stopped. The air thickened, still and full. The sea fell silent outside. The candle stretched, its flame leaning toward the crack. Then a faint sound, not the creak of a hinge, but the delicate turning of a key. Her breath hitched. The outline shimmered faintly, glowing for less than a second before fading back into shadow. In that flash, she thought she saw the faint shape of a hand pressing from the other side. But she didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her pulse echoing in her throat, her eyes locked on the door that wasn't yet open but wanted to be. When time resumed, it did so gently, as though trying not to wake her. The clock ticked again. The candle righted itself. The sea returned, whispering against the rocks. Silara exhaled slowly, tears blurring her vision. She wasn't sure if she had imagined it, or if she had simply remembered something her mind had kept hidden. The next morning, when sunlight filtered through her curtains, she noticed something new. On her desk lay the music box from her dreams. It was small and silver, just as she'd seen it, its surface cool to the touch. She turned it over in trembling hands. There was no dust, no rust, no sign it had ever been buried or lost. She turned the tiny key once. The melody that played was the same, fragile, trembling, impossibly real. And when the last note faded, she heard it again from behind the wall, that soft, answering hum, like another version of the same song playing in a room beyond time. The house was listening. The door was remembering, and Silara knew now that it wasn't waiting to be opened. It was waiting for her to return. The voice beyond. Night arrived gently, as it always did, creeping over the sea like a tide of glass. The cottage seemed to wait for it, settling into its quiet rhythm, the faint tick of the clock, the hush of waves breathing against the cliffs, the occasional cry of a gull that lingered too long awake. Silara had stopped pretending that she didn't expect what came next. Every night had become a small ritual, tea cooling beside her bed, notebook open, candle flickering at the edge of her vision. The world would narrow until there was only her, the clock, and the house, listening in perfect silence. At 3:02, she felt it before she saw it, the subtle tilt in the air, the way her pulse began to echo faintly in her ears, the scent of lavender curling like invisible smoke. The seconds thickened, stretching wider and wider, until she could almost see them, thin silver threads, trembling between her and the wall. Then the clock froze. 3:03. Silara rose from her chair and knelt beside the hidden frame. Her fingers brushed the cool wood, following its outline. The cottage was utterly still, and yet she could feel movement, not in the room, but in the air behind the wall, as if something vast was turning in its sleep. She leaned closer, pressing her ear to the plaster dot. At first, only silence. Then a whisper, her name, faint, trembling, carried through like breath through water. Silara. The sound was soft, almost tender, and yet it struck her chest like a pulse. The voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was her own, older, maybe, or sadder. The tone of someone remembering her life from far away. She pulled back slightly, her breath fogging the surface. The whisper came again, clearer this time, stretched thin like it had traveled through miles of air or years of silence. Silara, her throat tightened. The sound seemed to echo through her bones. She couldn't tell if it was speaking from behind the wall or inside her mind. The distinction felt meaningless now. The lavender scent thickened, sweet and sharp. Her fingers tingled as she reached toward the faint crack along the frame. It felt alive, humming with a warmth that wasn't light but memory. The moment her skin touched it, a pale shimmer spilled through the lines of the wall. It wasn't light like flame or electricity. It was something softer, fluid, like moonlight reflected on water. The air rippled, and the entire room seemed to bend. The floor beneath her tilted, though she hadn't moved. The shelves swayed gently, the candlelight quivering across their surfaces. The sound of the sea deepened, shifting from a distant whisper to something immense, the roar of time. Moving backward, Silara gasped softly as the edges of the room began to waver. The corners lost their solidity, melting into translucent waves of color. The clock on her table dissolved into streaks of gold, its frozen hands bending like reeds in a current. She tried to step back, but her body felt caught between two pulses, one her own and one slower, deeper, the rhythm of something eternal. Her voice, when it came, barely existed. "What are you?" And then the whisper answered, though not with words. It came as feeling, a flood of memory that wasn't entirely hers. Images spilled through her mind, a man's hands shaping wood in candlelight, a girl laughing by the sea, her hair full of wind, a silver clock gleaming on a table, a woman herself kneeling beside a wall that glowed softly, whispering her own name as though calling into eternity. The realization unfurled like light breaking through fog. This wasn't a haunting, it was an echo. A loop. The door wasn't a passage. It was an hour that had never ended, still replaying itself like a forgotten melody, searching for someone to listen. Silara pressed her palms against the wall. The shimmer grew stronger, bleeding through her fingers. The plaster rippled beneath her touch, soft as fabric. For a moment, she felt the pull, gentle but vast, the way the sea pulls everything it loves back toward itself. Her reflection wavered in the light before her, not the woman she was now, but a flicker of other selves, a child by the shore, a figure standing in stormlight, the clockmaker's daughter perhaps, or maybe the dream of her. The whisper came again, only this time it wasn't calling her, it was answering her. "I remember you." The words barely formed, but they shook her to her core. Tears blurred her vision, though she couldn't tell why. There was grief there, but also relief, the kind one feels when finally recognized after being lost too long. The light brightened, pulsing softly. She could almost see through the wall now, shapes moving in rhythm with her heartbeat, faint, shimmering outlines of another room beyond, maybe another life. Frozen mid-moment, on the other side stood a figure, hand pressed against the same surface. The light bent around it, like water around stone. It was her, older, maybe, or younger. Or, from the minute that had never finished passing, the same eyes, the same quiet ache in them. The two Silara mirrored each other in silence, separated only by a veil of light. The world around them trembled like the edge of a dream about to wake. Then a sound soft, like the turning of gears. The air between them pulsed once, twice, then split open with a sigh for a heartbeat. She saw everything, the sea folding inward, clocks dissolving into mist, stars moving backward through the sky, the door, or hour, or memory, unfurled completely, revealing a landscape made of light and shadow, where every sound seemed both near and far. Her other self reached toward her, hand glowing faintly. "Don't forget," the voice said, "it waits for us." And before Silara could respond, the world rushed inward. The light folded back into the crack, the sound collapsed into silence, and she found herself kneeling once more on the wooden floor of her cottage. The candle had gone out, the air was still cold, the wall was whole again. Only the faintest trace of warmth lingered beneath her palm. The clock ticked softly behind her to 3:04. She sat there for a long time, eyes fixed on the place where the light had been. The scent of lavender hung around her like memory, faint but unyielding. For the first time, she felt not alone but doubled, as though part of her was still there, on the other side of that moment, waiting to finish what time had paused. When dawn came, she didn't sleep. She walked down to the shore barefoot, the sand cool beneath her feet. The horizon shimmered, pale and endless. The tide was low, and the rocks glistened like hidden fragments of glass. The world seemed fragile, newly made. She could still feel that pulse under her skin, that rhythm belonging not to heartbeats, but to the quiet breath between minutes. As the first light broke over the water, she whispered to the sea, "It isn't just a door." Her voice trembled, carrying softly into the wind. "It's an hour that never ended." And though the waves answered only with foam and hush, something within her stirred, the echo of her own name, calling again from a place just beyond sound. Between seconds. The night she opened the door, the world felt softer than ever before. The sea was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Even the stars seemed to dim their brightness, as if watching in silence. The hour was near, that narrow seam between night and dawn, where the world hesitates, unsure whether to end or begin again. Silara sat by the wall for a long time, candlelight trembling round her. The events of the previous nights had blurred the boundary between dream and waking. She no longer knew which side of the hour she truly lived on. The voice, the shimmer, the echo of herself. It all felt like a memory she hadn't lived yet. The hidden frame before her pulsed faintly, as though sensing her decision. The air shimmered, soft waves of silver light rippling outward from the crack. She reached toward it slowly, her hand steady now. Fear had long left her. What replaced it was something gentler, an ache for understanding. The clock ticked once, twice, then stopped. 3:03. The world folded inward. The air around her thickened, curling in slow spirals. The sound of the sea vanished, replaced by a deep, rhythmic hum. Her candle flame stretched, stilled, and then froze, its shape suspended mid-flicker. Droplets of melted wax hovering in the air like captured rain. The wall before her trembled, then parted. The crack widened into a thin seam of light, soft as breath, spilling across the floor. It wasn't bright, only endless, the kind of glow that made the edges of things disappear. Silara hesitated for just a heartbeat, then stepped forward. The air shifted the moment she crossed. It was like falling into stillness, into the quiet space between two heartbeats. The world beyond was beautiful in a way that stole sound from her throat. Everything shimmered with a faint, silvery hue. Raindrops hung motionless in the air, catching glints of frozen moonlight. The sky above her was layered, dark clouds frozen mid-swirl, each one painted with light that never moved. She took a few steps forward, the ground beneath her soft as mist. Her reflection shimmered faintly on its surface, though it bent and changed as she moved, rippling like water, remembering a shape. Silara turned, half expecting to see her cottage behind her, but there was nothing, only the outline of the door, glowing faintly in the distance, floating like an opening carved into the fabric of silence. She could still see her candle through it, its flame unmoving. Time hadn't stopped here. It had simply been set aside. "Where am I?" she whispered. The sound of her voice echoed endlessly, returning softer each time, until it sounded like someone else whispering back. She walked deeper into the still world, the hem of her dress brushing suspended drops that didn't fall. Each one quivered faintly when she touched it, sending tiny ripples of light through the air. There was no sound but her breath, and even that felt borrowed. After what could have been moments or centuries, she saw something ahead. A figure sitting on the ground beneath a tree made entirely of glass. The leaves shone like crystals, and every branch shimmered with light that never dimmed. The figure was small, a girl, barefoot, dark-haired, dressed in the same soft blue Silara had worn years ago. The child was tracing circles in the still air, humming a faint tune. A music box rested beside her, silver, with a winding key shaped like a crescent moon. The melody that filled the air was one Silara knew, fragile, looping endlessly, the same one from her dreams. She stopped a few paces away, her voice caught between recognition and disbelief. "It's you." The girl looked up. Her eyes were gentle, wide, curious, and they were hers. Not a reflection, not a ghost, but the version of herself she had once been before the world had grown too heavy. The child smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting. "You came back." Silara's throat tightened. "Back from where?" The girl tilted her head. "You forgot this place. You left when it hurt too much." A wave of memory broke quietly. Inside Silara, flashes of a storm, a loss, and the moment her heart had folded into silence. The face of someone she had loved and lost drifted through her mind like fog. She had buried that pain so deeply that she'd mistaken it for peace. The girl stood and walked closer, her bare feet making no sound. "You built a door for it, not with wood, not with hands, but with time. Every night, when you couldn't bear to remember, you sealed it here, between seconds, where nothing could touch it." Silara's eyes filled. The door, it wasn't haunted. The child shook her head. No, it was waiting. They stood facing one another in that quiet, unmoving world. The woman who had learned to live with absence, and the girl who had never learned to let go. Silara knelt down until they were eye to eye. "I didn't mean to forget you," the child smiled. "A small, sad thing. You had to. You wouldn't have survived otherwise." A suspended raindrop hung between them, glowing faintly. Inside its reflection, Silara saw both their faces, the woman and the child, blurred into one shape. The girl reached out and touched Silara's hand. The contact sent a wave of warmth through her, not sharp, but deep, like a light finding its way through old cracks. and in that touch, memories unfurled. The laughter that used to fill her home, the music that had once played in the background of her happiest days, the night the world had changed, a voice crying her name through the storm, and then the sound of silence that followed. Silara gasped, pressing a hand to her heart. The ache she'd carried for years surged, bright and unbearable. For a moment, she thought it would break her, but the girl's hand held steady. "It's all right," the child whispered. "You don't have to keep it locked away." The world around them rippled gently. The still raindrops began to tremble, the air thickening with movement that had been waiting too long. Silara felt tears streaming down her face, tears that glowed faintly as they fell, suspended mid-air before dissolving into light. "I was so afraid that if I remembered, I'd never stop hurting. And now?" the child asked softly. Silara breathed, slow and deep. "Now I think not remembering hurts more." The girl nodded once, then smiled. Not the smile of innocence, but of release. "Then you're ready." A faint hum filled the air, the same hum she had heard through the walls, now vast and alive. The music box began to turn on its own, its melody deepening until it blended with the rhythm of the world awakening. The frozen raindrops began to fall, slowly at first, then all at once, silver rain cascading through the stillness, touching everything it had once avoided. The glass tree shimmered brighter, its branches trembling with light. Silara closed her eyes. The sound of rain became the sound of breath, her own, steady and alive. When she opened them again, the girl was gone. In her place lay the music box, its lid open, its final note fading. The still world began to dissolve, like watercolor sinking into paper. The sky softened, the ground blurred, the door behind her shimmered brighter. Silara turned toward it. The crack of light had widened into an arch, glowing like dawn. She walked forward slowly, her footsteps echoing faintly across the dissolving world. Every drop of rain that touched her seemed to lighten her body, like the grief was finally lifting from her bones. Just before she stepped through, she turned back one last time. The landscape of frozen moonlight was fading, folding into mist. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking the girl, or the door, or the part of herself that had waited patiently in silence all these years. She stepped through, the air shifted, the scent of lavender returned, faint, fleeting, like a memory saying goodbye. The clock on her table ticked once more. 3:04. Silara stood in her cottage again. The candle long melted down to wax. Everything was the same, yet not. The air felt lighter, the silence kinder. She looked toward the wall. The hidden frame was gone. Not sealed, not broken, simply no longer there. As if it had never needed to exist at all. On her desk lay the music box. She turned the key gently. It played the same tune, but this time it didn't sound sad. It sounded whole. She closed her eyes and let it play. The wind outside brushed softly against the window, carrying the scent of rain. For the first time since moving to the seaside town, Silara didn't wait for 3:03. She didn't need to, because she had learned what the house had been trying to tell her all along. Some doors don't lead to other worlds. They lead back to the parts of ourselves we once abandoned, and when we're ready, they open. the door that sleeps. The first light of dawn crept softly across the room. It touched the edges of the curtains, the wooden floorboards, the small table where a candle had melted into silence. The sea outside was calm, the horizon tinted with faint gold. For the first time in what felt like years, the morning didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a return. Silara stirred. She had fallen asleep against the wall, her cheek pressed against the cool wood, her fingers still resting near the spot where the crack had once been. The faint scent of salt and lavender lingered in the air, though now it smelled clean, like a storm that had finally passed. For a long while, she didn't move. She simply breathed, feeling the quiet hum of the house around her. It no longer felt heavy. The silence that once pressed on her chest now seemed to hold her gently, like a calm tide instead of an undertow. When she finally opened her eyes fully, she noticed the change. The wall was whole again, smooth, seamless. The faint outline of the hidden frame had disappeared, as though it had never existed. The light from the window brushed softly across it, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw a shimmer beneath the paint, like a secret sighing in its sleep. The clock on her table still read 3:03. The hands had never moved. Again she smiled faintly, not with surprise, not with fear, but with understanding. That hour had ended. She rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. The cottage creaked softly in the morning breeze, the familiar sound of wood shifting and settling. The waves outside rolled in gentle rhythms, whispering against the shore. Once, their echo had sounded like loneliness. Now it felt like conversation, the kind that doesn't need words. Silara walked to the window. The sea was a mirror of light, the surface calm enough to hold the sky. Seagulls drifted in slow arcs above the cliffs. Somewhere in the distance, a fishing boat rocked quietly, its sail glowing pale against the morning. She leaned her forehead against the glass and closed her eyes. Every breath felt anchored now, each heartbeat steady and full. The house, once so full of questions, had grown still. It had listened, and, in its own quiet way, it had spoken back. A part of her wondered whether the door had ever truly been in the wall at all. Maybe it had been somewhere else, somewhere deeper, between her ribs, beneath her memories, waiting for her to notice it. The thought made her smile again, soft and small. She walked to her desk, the faint creak of the floor following her like an old companion. Her journal lay open where she had left it days ago, a pen resting across the page. The ink had dried mid-sentence, as if her thoughts had paused to breathe with her. She sat down, feeling the gentle rhythm of the sea beneath her feet. For a moment, she just looked at the empty space on the page, thinking of all that had happened, or perhaps all that she had finally remembered. And then she began to write. Her handwriting was slower now, steadier. She didn't write about the whispers, or the light, or the frozen rain. She didn't write about the clockmaker, or the legend, or the girl beneath the glass tree. Those things no longer needed words. She wrote only one final line. The door still opens, but only for those ready to close it. When she finished, she set the pen down and touched the words gently. feeling the texture of the ink against the page. There was no tremor in her hand this time, no hesitation. Outside, the sky had turned a deeper gold, the cottage filled with warmth, brushing across her face and hair. Silara stood and looked around one last time. The shelves, the small table by the window, the chair where she used to sit and listen to the creaks in the night. Everything looked softer now, as though the light itself remembered her. She gathered her small bag, folded the journal, and placed it carefully inside. When she reached for the door, she hesitated, her hand resting on the worn brass handle. The house seemed to breathe around her, the faint sound of wood expanding in sunlight, the whisper of curtains shifting in the morning wind. "Thank you," she murmured. The house didn't answer, but a single draft brushed her cheek, cool and gentle, like a sigh of farewell. When she stepped outside, the sea air met her, cool, fresh, alive. The morning sun shimmered across the waves, casting long lines of light that danced over the stones. She walked down the small path that led toward the shore, her boots brushing dew from the grass. The tide was coming in, slow and rhythmic, each wave folded neatly into the next, the foam curling like the edge of a page turning itself. Silara walked until the sea touched her shoes. She stood there a while, listening. The sound of the water had changed. It no longer echoed loss. It carried something else now, a promise, perhaps, or maybe just peace. She closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. Every crash, every whisper, every retreating wave seemed to speak the same word. Stay, not in the house, not in the past, but here, in the moment. The wind lifted her hair. The sunlight caught in her eyelashes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something unseen to arrive. She didn't listen for the creak of a door. She didn't count the seconds to 3:03. Time moved again, and so did she. She turned back toward the cottage once more. From this distance, it looked different, smaller, softer, like a shell left behind by a creature that had finally grown beyond it. She smiled at the thought. She knew she would leave soon. The world beyond the cliffs was waiting, wide and open. She didn't know where she would go, only that wherever she went, she would carry the stillness she'd found inside that hour. As she began to walk back up the path, a flash of light caught her eye. She turned and saw, in the window of the cottage, the faintest glimmer, as if, for just an instant, the wall inside had remembered its door, but it was only the reflection of the morning sun. Silara smiled and continued walking. Later that afternoon, as she packed her few belongings, she noticed the clock on her table again. Its hands still pointed to the same time, 3:03. The face of it had gathered a thin film of dust, though the glass still caught the light. She picked it up, holding it gently. The weight of it felt familiar, comforting. It had once been a symbol of unease, of something waiting beyond understanding. Now it was just a clock, a reminder that some moments are meant to stay still. She didn't wind it, she didn't fix it, she simply placed it back down, exactly as it was. When evening came, she stood outside once more. The air was soft and golden, the sea reflecting the pink hues of sunset. The sound of gulls drifted across the water, faint and far away. Silara sat on the small stone wall by the path, her journal resting on her knees. She opened it to the last page and read the line again. The door still opens, but only for those ready to close it. The words felt truer now than when she had written them. She closed the book and looked toward the horizon. The tide was rising again, steady and sure. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows over the sand, gentle, not haunting. Somewhere behind her, the house settled one last time, its old beams sighing softly in the wind. She whispered into the air, half to herself, half to the sea, "Sleep well, old door." And with that, she turned away. The waves rolled in, the light dimmed, and somewhere in the heart of the house by the sea, time itself seemed to exhale, not ending, not beginning, simply resting. The door that had once opened at 3:03 slept quietly within the walls, no longer waiting, no longer watching, its purpose fulfilled, its hour at peace. And as night fell gently over the town, Silara walked onward toward a world that finally moved with her. The candle fades, the waves move quietly through the dark. Silara sleeps, her hand resting near the open page. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sea breathes, calm, infinite, eternal. Time no longer waits, it simply rests. Thank you for joining me tonight, dreamer. May your sleep be gentle and your dreams kind. Until next time, from Whispers of the Night.